Night wrapped the Wyoming prairie in silence, hiding a spark destined to ignite the nation. A slight college student stepped into a bar seeking acceptance, unaware that two strangers were sharpening hate. Hours later, an old pickup cut through the dark, carrying a secret that would soon freeze America in shock. At dawn, a passing cyclist discovered a battered body bound to a lonely fence, and the name Matthew Shepard began to echo across every screen and courthouse. This brutal crime would turn grief into law, forcing a country to face the cost of cruelty and the power of courage. Twilight draped Laramie, Wyoming in restless purple when the secret began its crawl, slipping beneath neon signs and humming power lines, searching for a heartbeat to shatter. Outside the fireside lounge, jukebox echoes mixed with prairie wind, but inside, hope flickered in the eyes of Matthew Shepard, a slight young man aching to breathe without apology. Laramie itself felt caught between frontier legend and modern change, its quiet streets hiding both kindness and latent threat and waiting for a spark of reckoning soon. He told a friend that afternoon that he was done folding himself small done, letting whispers define his name, done letting fear steal the future. Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson leaned over lukewarm drinks, their pockets thin, their anger thick. They talked in murmurs soaked with cheap whiskey, inventing a story about giving a ride, about being friendly locals, about nothing to fear. Matthew chose to believe them, because believing is easier than suspecting, and because every closet door he had ever opened scraped splinters across his soul. When they offered the lift, he thanked them, buttoned his jacket, and followed. The truck rumbled out of town, along dirt veins that cut through the prairie. At first, the cab held nervous small talk, but the temperature dropped when slurs began to spill jagged syllables that sliced the air. Matthew stiffened, realizing too late that kindness had turned to trap. A fist struck without warning, blood blooming across his cheek, the steering wheel jerking as Russell kept the tires aimed toward darkness. Dust rose behind them like a severed lifeline. They stopped beside a wooden fence on the high plain, a lonely grid of posts that looked like a forgotten cross in moonlight. They dragged Matthew from the cab, orders barked hatred burning in every kick. The pistol butt cracked his skull boots, crushed his ribs. Curses echoed across grass that had never asked to witness murder. Stars stared unblinking. Coyotes watched from shadow. No one intervened. Binding him to the post, they laughed about robbing him, tore at pockets, claimed his money, his shoes, his beating heart. Matthew whispered a prayer, voice clogged with blood, asking not for rescue, but for understanding, for a world that might remember love more fiercely than it remembered violence. The attackers drove away taillights shrinking until even fury could not find them, leaving silence so complete it felt like the prairie had forgotten language. Hours slid past in freezing increments. Frost gathered on wounds, breath became smoke. Night drained color from sky and skin alike. Matthew drifted through memories to escape pain, recalling childhood bike rides along Casper streets, the French countryside from school trips the first time. He admitted aloud that he loved differently, and the relief that followed. Each recollection shone like fragile glass against the numb weight of his body. Just after sunrise, cyclist Aaron Kreifels cut across the plain seeking a shortcut. He spotted a shape at the fence that looked at first like a scarecrow, tattered by wind. He slowed dread crawling up his spine and saw the shape breathe. He dropped his bike knees, shaking fingers, fumbling for his phone. His voice trembled as he begged the dispatcher to send help faster than the wind. Sirens shredded the quiet. Paramedics rushed in red flash shoes, crunching frost faces blanching at the brutality laid bare. A pulse flickered weakly beneath broken skin. They wrapped blankets, lifted carefully, whispered, "Hold on, hold on." The ambulance roared toward Fort Collins, Colorado, because Laramie lacked the tools to mend such ruin. News leapt ahead of flashing lights. By noon, local radio interrupted farm reports to announce a savage beating. Reporters converged cameras, glinting like predatory eyes, hungry for angles, for quotes, for outrage. Students at the University of Wyoming huddled in dining halls, whispering hate crime under breath. Parents called dorm rooms and begged children not to walk alone after dark. Doctors fought under fluorescent glare, relieving pressure in Matthew Shepard's skull-stitching torn flesh, pushing air into failing lungs. Machines beeped staccato warnings. Nurses smoothed his hair and spoke gentle words he could not hear. Outside sliding glass doors, vigil organizers passed out candles and plastic cups. The campus prepared for nightfall with a sorrow it had never rehearsed. In town, detectives built timelines, pieced together bar tabs, tracked the truck, knocked on trailer doors. McKinney and Henderson were arrested before sundown, shackled silent eyes hollow. The mugshots hit the wires, pixels scattering across television screens nationwide. Viewers paused mid-dinner to stare at faces that looked frighteningly ordinary. That evening, the first vigil ignited. Students, faculty, farmers, and truckers gathered around flickering points of light, their breaths forming pale halos in the cold. Someone read the 23rd Psalm without theatrics, just steady cadence carried on wind. Others sang softly, "Amazing Grace." Tears streaked cheeks, froze melted again. Reporters filmed everything. America watched in living rooms and airport lounges, stunned that such cruelty could sprout in open plains beneath honest sky. Matthew, Mother Judy, and Father Dennis arrived at the hospital. Exhaustion etched deep grief deeper still. They held his hand, marveling at its warmth, despite the tubes promising him he was loved, that his light would not go out. In that room, hope coexisted with impending loss, fragile as the monitor lines that rose and fell. Outside the hospital, protesters appeared, some bearing placards of solidarity, others twisting scripture into venom. Police built barriers to keep chance from colliding. Media trucks widened the circus towers of lights, glaring into night as though trying to force darkness into confession. Every interview ended the same. Will Matthew survive, and will justice follow? Across the nation, pastors rewrote Sunday sermons, politicians drafted statements, activists booked flights to Wyoming. Television hosts reminded audiences that hate crimes legislation languished in Congress, unfinished, waiting for a name to galvanize action. That name was taking shape in headlines, even as his life balanced on a thread. The prairie wind rose after midnight, rattling windows in the ICU, whipping flags outside police headquarters, carrying whispers over deserted streets. Some swore they felt an atmosphere change, as if the whole country inhaled at once, bracing for either miracle or mourning. Stars wheeled overhead, indifferent yet enduring, bearing witness to the fragile, heroic struggle of a young man bound to a fence, but unbroken in spirit. Dawn broke over the Colorado plains, and the hospital corridors filled with a hush that felt heavier than night. Nurses hovered like solemn angels, checking drip lines, smoothing linen, whispering updates that sounded like prayers. Matthew remained motionless, his breath delivered by machinery, his heartbeat faltering in irregular taps that echoed through the monitors. Outside, early sunlight painted narrow bands of gold across the waiting room, where students and truckers and ministers shared thermoses of bitter coffee, each sip a fragile excuse for hope. Reporters fumbled with notebooks, uncertain whether to compose triumph or tragedy, while security guards shifted uneasily, bracing for crowds that had yet to arrive. Through sliding doors walked Judy and Dennis, hands clasped, shoulders squared against despair. They paused at the foot of the bed, tracing a finger along Matthew's bruised knuckles, speaking softly about childhood hikes and Christmas songs reminding him of every kindness he had ever shown. Doctors explained that swelling in the brain had grown merciless, that oxygen fought a losing war, that time was receding like tide from shore. The parents' knotted eyes clear their silence, a pact to carry whatever verdict came. In the hallway, a chaplain murmured scripture without chapters, words weaving comfort through sterile air. At 6:48 on October 12, the monitors surrendered their rhythmic blip, shifting into a flat line as cold and unyielding as the prairie fence. Nurses pressed buttons, physicians confirmed, and a hush descended so complete that even the fluorescent lights seemed to dim. Judy laid her cheek against Matthew's forehead, whispering that he could rest, promising that his voice would not be lost. Dennis closed his eyes, recalling the day his son first laughed, the fragile miracle of that sound. In the stillness of that room, a single truth crystallized, that courage can outlast breath. News broke within minutes. Anchors interrupted weather reports, scrolling banners in urgent red proclaiming the death of the young Wyoming student. Radio hosts choked on sentences, and callers flooded lines with tears and fury. Candlelight vigils that had been tentative now blazed flames, multiplying on courthouse steps from Vermont to California. In New York, hundreds gathered in the rain outside Stonewall, chanting Matthew's name between gusts of wind, declaring that they would not forget. Helicopters hovered above the hospital cameras, fixed on any doorway that might deliver a statement. The roar of rotors mixing with grieving voices. Laramie awoke to a surge of strangers reporters, trailing cables activists unfurling banners, mourners tacking rainbow ribbons onto bulletin boards. Some residents offered hot soup and spare blankets. Others glared from porch swings, uneasy with scrutiny. The local pastor postponed a harvest sermon to address the widening wound, urging compassion, while a traveling preacher parked a van painted with hateful slogans, preaching damnation through a cracked loudspeaker. Police erected barriers separating sorrow from venom, though sound carried across the divide like shrapnel. Days later, a memorial service filled the University of Wyoming Fieldhouse. Choir voices rose trembling on the edge of grief, while politicians recited prepared remarks that disguised shock with officious cadence. Judy stepped to the podium and spoke without notes, her words simple, yet unbreakable, insisting that violence done in darkness would be answered by light. Cameras flashed, capturing her steady gaze, broadcasting resilience into homes where children watched with wide eyes. A nation divided by policy felt united by one raw heartbeat of mourning. Meanwhile, detectives pieced together the timeline, mapping bar receipts, cell phone calls, pawn shop visits, where stolen shoes had been traded for $20. The district attorney filed charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping robbery, and proposed a hate crime enhancement that Wyoming law did not yet recognize. Legal analysts filled primetime slots, debating the power of intent versus the terror of result, dissecting every statute paragraph, as if letters could contain emotion. Civil rights leaders called for a federal solution demanding protection that crossed state lines, like the windswept highway that had carried Matthew's final ride. The trial of Aaron McKinney began 12 months later, in a small courtroom heavy with history. Wooden benches strained under the weight of journalists, activists, and local ranchers wearing dusted boots. The prosecution painted a portrait of premeditated cruelty, parading blood-stained sneakers and shattered skull X-rays. Each exhibit a testament to hatred. Defense attorneys attempted gay panic strategies, arguing that unwelcome advances sparked temporary insanity, a claim that drew gasps and clenched fists from the gallery. Expert witnesses refuted every excuse, describing how fractures angled and hemorrhages spread, proving that the assault eclipsed any fleeting impulse. Outside the courthouse, demonstrators lined the sidewalks. On one side stood supporters carrying photos of Matthew, smiling beneath mountain peaks, chanting, "Love is stronger than hate." On the other side stood members of a fringe church, brandishing placards of condemnation, their voices shrill, their messages carved from fear. Police officers stood between them, hands on batons, faces blank. Reporters drifted like gulls, gathering quotes, measuring anguish in decibels. Inside, a jury deliberated for hours that stretched like years. They returned with a verdict of felony murder recommending life imprisonment without parole. In a surprising motion, Judy and Dennis requested the state spare McKinney from the death penalty, explaining that another death would not heal the first. The courtroom exhaled. Judge and bailiff wiped eyes. Even the defense seemed staggered by such mercy. A week later, Russell Henderson accepted a plea deal, choosing life sentences over uncertain judgment, acknowledging guilt in a voice drained of defiance. With verdicts recorded, national focus shifted to Congress. Lawmakers resurrected stalled hate crime legislation, naming it for Matthew Shepard and for James Byrd, Jr., a black man dragged to death in Texas earlier that same year. Lobbyists crowded marble corridors, quoting statistics relaying stories from vigil stages. Opponents muttered about states' rights budgets, moral decay. Supporters invoked the fence on the prairie and the chain on the pickup, insisting that the lines must be drawn where humanity begins. The bill passed the House, then languished in the Senate year after year, until a new administration vowed completion. In October 2009, President Barack Obama signed the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd, Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, his pen pressed into paper beneath flashbulbs, while Judy and Dennis watched with quiet triumph, their hands clasped just as they had been in the hospital. Culture shifted. Universities launched safe space programs. High schools formed gay straight alliances, some meeting in borrowed classrooms after sunset, some braving daylight announcements. Theater troupes staged the Laramie Project, a play stitched from interviews conducted in aftermath, its dialogue carrying Matthew's story from town halls to Broadway. Film crews followed documentaries, spliced archival footage with new grief. There were songs on country radio stations that once avoided the subject. There were children who found courage in those songs, choosing honesty over silence, stepping into daylight with rainbow bracelets and tentative smiles. In Laramie, a small park near the university planted trees in Matthew memory, their branches reaching across seasons, their leaves rustling with each passing truck. The fence where he had been tied stood for years, weathered by sun and snow, until the landowner quietly removed it, worried about tourists tripping over loose wire. Activists salvaged 2 worn posts, donating them to a museum where glass and velvet ropes could frame history without erasing rawness. Visitors leaned close, searching for meaning in splintered wood, reading plaques that listed dates but could never list heartbeats. Matthew remains were interred in Washington National Cathedral in 2018, welcomed into sacred stone alongside presidents and poets. Choir voices rose once more, reverberating beneath the stained glass, their harmonies drifting into nave arches like doves. Pilgrims knelt, some whispering thanks, some asking forgiveness, some promising action. The cathedral bells tolled, echoing across the capital, where lawmakers still debated new rights, new protections, new definitions of equality. Yet, hatred did not vanish. Across the years, tragedy returned in new forms at a Florida nightclub, at a California high school, at a Colorado Springs bar, each time rekindling the pain of that first brutal night. But each time also rekindling resistance as crowds massed with candles and songs, and an unyielding refusal to surrender. The Matthew Shepard Foundation continued its work, led by his parents visiting military bases, corporations, rural churches, telling a story not of death, but of determination. Judy, voice gentle yet steel-edged, urged listeners to choose compassion over fear, to imagine every stranger as family, to speak when silence invites violence. In classrooms across the country, teachers assigned essays on civil rights, including paragraphs about a young man in Wyoming who loved without apology. Students wrote reflections, some admitting their own hidden truths, some resolving to protect vulnerable peers. Social media feeds filled each October with tributes, hashtags carrying Matthew's name into timelines that did not exist when he walked the earth, proof that memory can evolve yet remain urgent. As the 25th anniversary approached, Laramie prepared a vigil under an open sky. Old friends returned, their hair silvered, their eyes still bright with the same determination that once lit candles against the wind. New residents joined, carrying toddlers on shoulders, explaining that the past shapes tomorrow. The choir rehearsed again, voices trembling but clear, and the university bell tower, ready to chime at the precise moment daylight surrendered to dusk. On that evening, the field house lights dimmed, and a single spotlight illuminated the empty lectern, where no one needed to stand because every attendee already carried the speech inside their chest. Thousands of candles ignited tiny galaxies flickering, mirrored by distant stars. Prairie wind coursed through the crowd, lifting smoke into swirling constellations. In that hush, each person felt the weight of promise that courage demands repetition, that justice is a road, not a destination, that one life can ripple through, decades bending the arc of history toward kindness. Somewhere beyond the town lights, coyotes howled, their voices raw but eerily melodic, as if nature itself sang a lament. From the parking lot, television crews captured the glow, their lenses reflecting pinpricks of flame, broadcasting hope to viewers who might otherwise feel alone. A mother in Kansas watched while folding laundry. A teenager in Alabama watched on a phone beneath blankets. A veteran in Oregon paused mid-step on a nightly walk, all breathing a little deeper, all remembering the name that had crossed their path for a quarter-century. When candles burned low, attendees placed them in steel bins, embers smoldering like distant campfires. Volunteers collected the wax to be melted into new candles for future vigils, because the work continues. As the last ashes cooled, the sky brightened with dawn, painting the horizon pink and gold. Railroad tracks glimmered, power lines hummed, grassland waved, and in that quiet sway, the spirit of Matthew seemed to move urging footsteps forward. Across the nation, schoolyards rang with morning bells, and children filed into classrooms where maps of Wyoming hung beside flagpoles. Some knew the story already. Some would learn today. All would live in a country forever altered by what happened on a lonely fence. New laws stood as guardians, not perfect, but stronger than before. Young couples held hands openly on city sidewalks, their laughter rising above traffic, casual, yet revolutionary. Rainbow banners fluttered from courthouse rafters during Pride months, reminders that government buildings can shelter hope. Still, there are corners where shadows linger, where fear sharpens into violence. Yet now, those corners face more eyes, more voices, more laws. Each threat meets a legacy forged in blood, but carried by love. And so, the story moves echoed in every town that chooses to illuminate difference, rather than bury it echoed in every song that celebrates truth, told at whatever cost, echoed in each vow that tomorrow will be kinder. Night returns as it always will, but the stars above Laramie keep watch distant and steady. They once bore silent witness to brutality. Now they witness resilience. They shimmer over the endless plain over the hospital, where paramedics still race to save lives over the courtroom, where justice continues its imperfect climb over the chapel where parents grieve and then stand to speak. Wind slips through fence posts, through cottonwood leaves, through open dorm windows, carrying a single name, Matthew. A name that once belonged only to a son and a friend, now belongs to a movement, to a law, to a lesson etched in the heart of a nation. And somewhere in that wind is the quiet certainty that stories can change, that laws can change hearts, that hearts can change the future, turning tragedy into rallying cry grief, into guardian silence, into anthem. The prairie knows this. The parents know this, and now the country knows this. The candles have burned low, but the light remains carried on breath, carried on paper, carried in memory. This is how a single life lost on a cold October night continues to guide millions toward the simple radical truth that every human spirit deserves to live unafraid, to love unashamed, to stand beneath the vast American sky and claim its place among the stars.